I lost my virginity in the 90s on a marble floor in a rich girl's condominium, while Fan Tipenching was playing in the room with the volume turned off. I was practically howling from the momentousness of the occasion, from the cold and horrible embarrassment, and from the bruising on my lower spine, when the girl looked up from her seat astride me, peered at the television, and said, "A noodle cart. You could have had anything you wanted, and you asked for a fucking noodle cart." She crawled toward the screen's blue light to turn on the volume. A woman with an ashen face was weeping over a set of aluminum tureens. I had just told the girl that I loved her. This was said in a moment of profound panic, the likes of which I haven't experienced since, and which I now belatedly associate with the 90s. But all she could do was recline her lithe, sweat-drenched body against the edge of her parents' leather couch and remonstrate against the limited ambitions of the poor. Few of us understood why we said what we said in the 90s. Some of us wish we hadn't said anything at all. We spent a lot of time in shopping malls in the 90s. A new one seemed to open every month. We didn't really go to buy things. We went for the free air conditioning, the food courts, the mad wonders inside. There was a zoo on top of one, an aquarium in the basement of another. Macaques screeched as they swung from post to post. Dugongs floated through the liquid ether like sedate albino spacemen. There was an Olympic-sized ice skating rink where I first held hands with the girl I would eventually lose my virginity to, the girl I would say that I loved, while we clumsily negotiated the ice together like fawns testing our new legs. There was a roller coaster that traversed the entire length of a mall, dipping and looping across the cavernous, fluorescent expanse. Teenagers would smoke weed in the parking structure and go ride that coaster for hours. It was something else to hear their collective screams echoing around the Galleria, high above the subfrequent din of the mall's light jazz, the thousands milling below, the disembodied announcements for a lost child or an illegally parked car. That's the sound I hear now when I think of the 90s, a bunch of stone kids yelling their heads off while they rose and dropped and rose again to awesome precipitous heights. Anand and I convinced our mother to ride that roller coaster with us once. She had seemed strangely silent all afternoon, none of the usual chatter or murmurs of delight, as we strolled past the mall's gleaming shop fronts. We thought that the roller coaster might cheer her up. She took some convincing, of course, but eventually relented. As we strapped her into the seat between us, she said, "This is a machine for yahoos and kids. This is not a machine for an old woman like me." And when we made our initial ascent, she hooked her arms tight around each of ours and stared unblinkingly at her feet, her lips pressed together in a grimace. Amid the cacophony of the ensuing ride, while we hung upside down for a moment from the mall's glass and steel ceiling, I turned to glance at our mother. She was still staring at her feet. She had not made a sound. Her face had turned a pale, yellowish tinge. "Ma," I yelled at the mauve sky glowing below us, high above the beams. "This is supposed to be fun, Ma." And Anand in tone was something similar. But soon as the world corrected itself by a swift mechanical swoop, I heard my mother say in a strange banshee voice, "You shut your mouth. All of you just shut your goddamn mouths. I'm fucking dying over here." We laughed. We had never heard our mother swear before. We would never hear her swear again. And when she screamed that last little bit, a bit about dying, we thought that she had been speaking figuratively. Because in the 90s, we often took figuratively what we should have taken literally. Things were never the things themselves, but always something else. Buildings were never simply buildings, but signs of our collective prosperity. Industrial parks heralded our emergence onto the international economic stage. New highways were the roads we'd all take to a resplendent national future. And so we laughed at our mother as that roller coaster tossed us around the Klieg lights. In the 90s, we learned to speak English. It was the world's lingua franca, we were told, the language of international business. You could practically hear the money ringing around in it. So we took lessons and dictations. We conjugated verbs, learned our tenses, practiced pronouncing our H's and our Z's. We bought shortwave radios and listened to the BBC. We tried to decipher British and American pop songs. On summer nights, we'd go to Khao San Road or Soi Khao Boi so we could get drunk and practice speaking English with Farangs. We needed to get drunk to talk to them. It was the only way to work up the courage. Before the 90s, most of us had never been closer to a Farang than the polite distance of a photograph. We'd wake up the next morning, remembering little of what we'd learned, though we'd sometimes have pleasant, light-saturated memories of the language rolling off of our liquor-loosened tongues, like we'd been speaking it all of our lives. My best friend in the 90s was a boy from Rattawut, near the Malaysian border, named Gawin Panchangtong. Gawin was none too popular at school. He was shy and knock-kneed. He had blotchy, coal-black skin and a provincial accent that he was at pains to hide. And he spent too much time reading sports manga, but he thrived on summer nights in the 90s among the Farangs. He became a different person then. He'd wear one of his ironed NBA jerseys, waddle up to some white girls at a bar and say, "How do you do? My name is Kevin. I am not handsome, but you are beautiful." And more often than not, the girls would laugh and buy us all drinks. They thought he was so charming and funny. Thai girls would have told him to go back to the Malaysian border. In the 90s, late one night, he said, "I am a poor Thai boy from countryside. I come from farmer land. So you buy me whiskey, yes?" And when the girls asked him what he'd do for them in return, he turned to me and said, "My friend and I dance secret Thai dance. We will do this for you. A secret Thai whiskey dance from Water Buffalo Farmerland." "You're kidding," I said in Thai, smiling stupidly at the girls. "Tell them you're kidding, Gawin." The bar fell silent. All eyes suddenly seemed fixed upon us. "Okay," one of the girls finally said. She and her 3 friends turned to face us, resting their elbows on the bar. They were hippies, as far as I could tell, bandanas, beaded necklaces, fabrics with vaguely Asian prints. "What are you waiting for? It's a deal. You two do your dance, and we'll buy you a round of whiskey." "Here's the plan," Gawin muttered to me in Thai. "I'm the buffalo." I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. As far as I knew, there was no such thing as a Thai whiskey dance from Water Buffalo Farmerland, and I was pretty sure that the Farang girls knew this too. Just then, Prikinu broke out on the bar's sound system, one of the most popular songs in the 90s, a synthesized dance number which compared the singer's love interest to an unbearably spicy chili pepper. In the 90s, there was a brief, inexplicable fad of pop songs that compared women to condiments. "I am Buffalo, you see," I heard Gawin's voice declare in English above the music. And when I turned around, I saw my best friend hopping and galloping knock-kneed back and forth across the room, his fingers held up to his forehead for horns. "He is my farmer," he said now, pointing at me, "and I am his buffalo. And now we do our dance." Thank you for laughing. I stood there before the Farang girls not knowing what to do. I did a lot of that in the 90s, standing around not knowing what to do, overwhelmed, bewildered, astonished. I asked myself questions I often asked in the 90s, questions such as, why am I here? And what am I doing? And what do I want? And would my mother approve of this? And why am I best friends with a black nerd from the Malaysian border? Many of these questions, it seemed, in the 90s, very important and very profound. Gawin continued to prance around the bar. The Farang girls were practically convulsing with laughter before me. Somebody started to clap to the music. There was a swell of cheers, of hollering, a leavening of the atmosphere. Soon it seemed that the whole place had joined in. Some people got out of their seats and made their way to the dance floor, Thais and Farangs alike. Gawin wove between them all with his fingers still protruding from his forehead, his eyes bright with excitement, a grin smeared across his face, his voice singing along to the song, the refrain of which now seems inseparable from the 90s. Quote, a pepper that spicy, that delicious, should be eaten to the point of regret. What the fuck did this mean? I wondered then, while the chaos mounted around me. Had the singer taken his metaphor too far? There was only one type of regret you could have over eating a chili pepper, in my experience, and that regret was always digestive. "Relax," I heard somebody say, and when I turned around, I saw one of the Farang girls standing with a tumbler of whiskey extended toward me. "Come on," she continued, taking my arm and leading me toward the dance floor. She was the first white person I'd ever touched in my life. "Your friend over there has got the right idea. You Thai boys need to loosen up. This," she twirled her hands in the air and started swaying her hips to the music. "This is the fucking 90s. Get a drink." In the 90s, it still meant something to get on an airplane. Tears were still shed at airports, handkerchiefs regularly used. Families huddled in small semicircles under Don Mueang International's floodlights, hugging one another, pressing each other's hands, taking photographs, as if they were sending their loved ones off to war. We weren't at war, of course. It was the 90s, remember? But when somebody disappeared through passport control, we often didn't know if we'd ever see them again. When our Uncle Jirachai went to work construction in Bahrain, our mother's entire extended family showed up at the airport, some from as far as Lopburi and Nakhon Sawan. Even Gawin insisted on coming along. "This is a big day for your family," he said. "These kinds of things are just as important as weddings and funerals." "My uncle hasn't died," I said. "He's just going to Bahrain." At the airport, we met people that we didn't even know we were related to. And during the 3 interminable hours of waiting around, in the 90s, we often arrived at airports excessively early. While the adults milled about in a dense familial mass, trading news, cracking jokes about each other's complexion and weight, recounting old stories so outrageous that they seemed, to our ears, invented and fantastical. And while some of our aunts wandered off to finger the duty-free, to rub lotions into hands and spray perfumes onto necks and then sniff each other afterwards. And while our 80-odd-year-old grandparents sat sentinel by Uncle Jirachai like sunken withered totems, refusing to let go of their eldest son's hands. While all of this went on all around us, on that morning in the 90s, my brother Anan, Gawin, and I, in our boredom, slipped away to smoke hashish with a guy who claimed to be our second cousin. He had a horrible mustache. "I hate to bring this up," Gawin said, when new cousin passed through the revolving glass doors ahead of us, "but I don't think that guy's your cousin. I don't really see the family resemblance." "Tell the nerd that he can stay if he wants," Anan hissed at me sharply. "He doesn't have to come. That's not a problem." In the 90s, Anan did a lot of drugs. I only did enough for my brother not to hate me. By that point in the 90s, I worried a lot about my older brother. I worried about what our mother's illness was doing to him. I worried about the French philosophy that he was reading at the university and how it had made him humorless. I worried about how he was gay and seemed to be worried about it, even though nobody else really did. But in the 90s, I didn't really know how to talk to my brother. New cousin passed us each a cigarette which had been emptied of its tobacco and tightly repacked with hash. "I thought we were doing drugs," Gawin said. Anan shot me a look. I wanted to dive head first over the edge of the parking ramp and take my stupid best friend with me. "Who the fuck is this guy?" new cousin asked. "Are you even in the family?" "That's so funny," Gawin said, chuckling, putting his arms around my shoulder. "I was just saying the same thing about you." "By the way," Gawin added, smiling at new cousin, "just so you know, something's died on your upper lip." Anan laughed so loudly and heartily then, deep-chested, tremulous, that the luggage boys and traffic cops paused to look in our direction. I could have listened to my brother's laugh forever. "The nerd's not so bad," Anan finally said, when he regained his breath, wiping at his eyes. And so afterwards, back inside, as if through an underwater smear, the adults growing quiet as the time for Uncle Jirachai's departure drew near. Our grandmother's lips trembling as if they might unhinge themselves from her wrinkled face, flutter up to join the sparrows twittering beneath the terminal ceiling. My uncle, wearing the construction company windbreaker, the lycra a green so bright it practically fluoresced, his weathered face a blank mask staring into the middle distance. The construction company representative checking his name against a clipboard, and now dozens and dozens of men like my uncle wearing that same construction company windbreaker, many of them beginning to line up for passport control, a mighty verdant army shimmering under the floodlights, some with their families huddled close around them, while those without had on their faces so much sadness and jealousy and fright and doubt and resignation that I wanted to cover my eyes. In the 90s, my uncle and those men, and many more men like them, would build some of the biggest hotels in the world. They would work on scaffolding so high, under a sun so blinding, that they had to bellow old Thai folk songs into the hot desert air to try to temper the vertigo. And now our mother, who never cries, weeping into the hollow of her eldest brother's chest, without any inhibition, without any sound, her small back convulsing in his large ropey arms, as if she was shivering and he was trying to keep her warm. And me only half comprehending then, in the 90s, that they are doing this because they both know that they will never see each other again, because our mother is sicker than anybody except Anan is willing to admit. And one by one, the siblings bidding goodbye to their brother, to Uncle Jirachai, whom I always admired and thought a cool guy, and who I suddenly remembered had taught me in the 80s how to hold a hammer and drive a nail home. All of the siblings retreat in a semicircle so that our grandparents can say goodbye. We turn away now. It is too much. The sounds in the terminal suddenly seem too loud, the lights too hot and bright. And so the four of us eye each other from our places in that family circle, Anand, Gawin, new cousin, and I, each of us tuned to our buzzing private frequency, sly grins and hooded eyes, and a small fist of laughter clenching and unclenching inside of us, like some riotous second heart. We cremated her at the family temple in Sampang, where our grandmother and grandfather had also been cremated just a few years before. By that point in the 90s, we had been waiting for so long that we thought we'd be prepared. We weren't. Nothing about the 90s could have prepared us for that kind of thing. It is hard to think of all that vitality and energy and love reduced to ashes in an urn. It was a small, quick ceremony. Everybody was there except for Uncle Jirachai, who sent us more money from Bahrain than we knew he could afford, and who called one night to say that there was work for me in the desert if I was interested. If I remember correctly, he said, "You do know how to hammer a nail." But I told him that the economy was still a tiger in Bangkok, and that I was actually no good with my hands. I also said my prospects were still bright for when I finished my university degree the following year. I told him I had big plans. This was a lie. I didn't know what I was going to do. I was still too full of grief and rage and confusion about losing our mother. And though I longed for a way out of the city, all I could think about when I talked to my uncle were those bright green windbreakers and the faces of those melancholy men. So I stayed in Bangkok in the 90s. Anand moved to the northeast to work for an NGO organizing the rural poor. At the newly renovated Hua Lamphong train station, my brother hugged me and told me that he loved me. He said that he would never have survived the last 5 years without me, and I told him the same. It suddenly seemed on that train platform like we knew how to talk to each other again. He also told me that he was gay. I smiled and said okay. I told him that I wasn't, that I was straight, and that I hoped he would find it in his heart to accept me for who I really am. And then I told him about losing my virginity in that rich girl's condominium, and so we both stood there laughing on that train platform until it was time for him to leave. Gawin moved into the house with me. At first I said I didn't need the pity or the charity, but he said, "I don't care what you need, I need the free rent." He was working as an entry-level clerk at the Thai Farmers Bank by that point, sending money home to his parents in Rattawut and saving to get treatment for his knock knee. Before the 90s, when he was a child, his parents had tried everything: acupuncture, herbal supplements, massages, Buddhist chants, Hindu animal sacrifice. But it was only in the 90s, with modern medicine and therapy, that my best friend got the gait that he desired. The treatment took nearly a year, and on the day that it was almost completed, Gawin and I got drunk and raced each other home, 6 long and dark kilometers across town, just to take his new legs for a spin. I let him win. In my own way, I also tried everything to get the gait I desperately desired: work, liquor, sex, exercise. I even spent 4 months at a temple cleaning toilets, sweeping the courtyard, feeding stray dogs, installing a new sound system for the monks. But for a long time during that part of the 90s, nothing seemed to work. It was still hard to go by that urn on the small wooden shrine above the kitchen doorway, a shrine that my brother and I had built with our own hands, and not feel like I was disappearing. My brother called me one day from the northeast and said that he was coming back. "What about the rural poor?" I asked. I was hoping that he'd be there doing that forever. It was something that had made him happy, and so often during those darkened days, it was solely by the light of my brother's happiness that I could glimpse the possibility of mine. "Oh, I haven't given up on them yet," he said, chuckling softly. "They're actually coming with me." He said that they were going to walk the 700 kilometers from the northeast to the government district in Bangkok to call for land reforms, to protest corruption and agribusiness, and to ask for government aid. They would pick up more protesters along the way. The journey would take a month. I followed the marches' every move in the papers, called my brother daily on his cell phone to see where they were. I pinned a map of the country to the dining room wall to track their progress. I retrieved books from boxes that I had put away what seemed like a lifetime ago: economic histories and political theories and sociological studies that I was supposed to read while I was at university. I even read my brother's French philosophy books just so I could make fun of him over the phone. Day by day, they got closer. Day by day, the protests grew larger. One afternoon, my brother called and said, "You'll never guess who I just ran into. You'll never guess who just joined the protests. Mustache, except he doesn't have one now." They were 80,000 strong by the time they reached the outskirts of Bangkok. Gawin took off work so we could go meet them at the Democracy Monument and walk the last 2 kilometers with them to the government house. I took the urn down from the shrine and brought her along. We waited an hour in the rain with 1,000 others before we could hear the protesters chanting and singing coming from afar, like some spectral choir vibrating in the upper air. And when at last they rounded the corner onto Rattawut, we searched for my brother Anand in that mass of humanity. When we finally found him, we saw that he was with the cousin, who was now unrecognizable in every way. And we joined them both there, the 4 of us together again, our voices raised among the thousands, while the banners billowed around us, marching through a valley of cops. That was how we ended the 90s. That's the story. Thank you. Maybe since I have a little bit of time left before Q&A, I'll just read a quick excerpt, the opening of this book I've been working on. And yeah. And then I'll take some questions if you guys have any. This is just the opening of a book, a novel. For those of you who know Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, there are echoes, which is unfortunate for me. Okay, so I'll just read for a little bit and then we'll do Q&A. All right, my name is Nga. For a long time I lived in places where nobody could say my name. In various cities of the West, my name was often unpronounceable, unpalatable on natives' tongues. You might say it was a muscular problem and you wouldn't be entirely wrong, although saying that a tongue is merely a muscle is a little like saying a genital is merely a reproductive organ. It's prudish and a little petulant, and it misses, despite its technical accuracy, a great deal. No, their inability to say my name, to pronounce it properly, to marshal their entire vocal apparatus, tongue, mouth, nose, palate, glottis, windpipe, so that they might emit that little sound, nga, 2 consonants, 1 vowel, a rising tone peculiar to Thai, a sound intended to identify this thing that, in my more wistful and melodramatic moods, I like to think of as self. Their difficulty with my name not only had something to do with their tongues, with their oral musculature, but also something to do with their ears. For they couldn't really hear my name, you see, and in order to say something, you must first be able to hear it correctly. Speaking is hearing the thing to be said, language a conditioning of the oral and oral faculties, and because the velar nasal, the consonantal NG, is absent in most Romance and Anglo-Saxon languages, many of my hosts were stone deaf to my name and mute as a result. We tried, of course, game and polite citizens of the Western world that they all were. Manners matter, decency too. You meet somebody, you learn their name. It's pro forma, non-optional, the first word of the first clause of most social contracts. But the odds were stacked against them from the start, like I said, and what they usually produced was not my name so much as a grotesque mispronunciation instead, a strange and malformed shadow sound. It was awful in their mouths, just awful, not a name so much as a strangled sonic emission, somewhere between a squawk, a coo, a cry of pain, and a thing that they couldn't swallow. Many literally seemed to choke on it. But I'm not complaining. I'm not protesting either, not really. It's not a tragic or even special circumstance. It's not even an uncommon one. I suspect that I am but one of many, part of an ever-growing multitude. It's mostly trying on the nerves and sapping on the spirit, having your name misheard and mispronounced for years and years. But it can be useful too, I have learned, for if they can't say your name, it stands to reason that they don't know who you are, and this can have its odd advantages, its strange and even perverse pleasures. It can be a source of terrific private comedy for one, especially once you learn to stop crying and start laughing about it, though it takes some years to staunch the tears, I'll admit. When you have a name like mine, one that seems to strangle your interlocutors, Even the most innocuous social exchange can become a kind of mischievous private experiment in the odd and wondrous capacities of the human voice box. The sounds that people have made trying to say my name, the mutually embarrassing vocalizations, the mewls, the squeaks, the breathless and guttural moans. I've been called many things in my life. I've been called, as the saying goes, all sorts of names, but none have ever been so strange as the names that people have called me when they think that they're saying my actual one. For another, the condition constantly reminds you of the important distinction between what people call you and who you are, who you might be. You are forced to live in a perpetual state of light existential error, which can be good preparation for the heavier ones down the line. When nobody can pronounce your name, when you've spent your adult life responding to grotesque deformations of its sound, you are made to feel at all times not only your foreignness to them, but also, more importantly, your foreignness to yourself. What's in a name? What does it mean? What does it matter? Who is this person that they're calling? What is that sound? And what does it mean for you to respond to it? You can start to lose track of yourself, in short, of who you think you really are. And while this can be a problem, and it certainly was during many of my farcical years abroad, it can also be, if you listen closely enough, a solution. One of the few times that somebody said it correctly was during sex, late in my foreign career, and she hadn't meant to say my name at all, I don't think. She had accidentally happened upon it while making a series of obligatory sex noises. Among the steady and syncopated timekeeping of her cries and grunts, I suddenly heard her utter my name, utter it clearly and correctly. It rang as a bell, as they say, in the midst of all that huffing and puffing. And it startled me so much, it scared me even, that I stopped making my own ridiculous noises and asked her to do it again. Wait, I said, did you just come? No, she said, not even close. Can you do that again? Do what? That thing you just did. This? She slowed for some reason, nearly grinding to a halt, as if I'd asked for a change of tempo. There was a look of grave and dangerous impatience on her face. I had clearly broken her concentration. I had clearly interrupted something important. You mean this? You like it like this? No, I said, not that. That's not what I meant. Say it. Say that thing that you said. I didn't say anything. I'm doing, not saying. My name, I said. You said it. Say it again. Oh, she laughed. Her impatience had transformed into a kind of pity now. It was not the first time, I suspected, that she had given men such as myself this particular look. She was beautiful, almost radiant with it. Oh shit, she said. You want that? She thought that I was making a boring, erotic request, but my desires at that moment were as far from erotic as possible. I wasn't trying to be kinky. It hadn't turned me on to hear my name. Quite the opposite, in fact. For a fleeting moment after she happened upon my name, I had felt naked somehow, truly naked in a way that had very little to do with what we were doing. It was as if that little accidental sound had turned on all the metaphysical lights in the room. It's not that I realized anything about my life at that moment. No, I don't believe in any of that. It's simply that something had felt clarified by that sound, something that I couldn't identify. My feelings and sensations seemed to take the outward form of an insight or an epiphany without any of the inward content. That little noise had suddenly saturated everything in a kind of blinding and unbearable light, though we remained plunged in the darkness of our apartment, and she remained but a lithe, shadowy form listing above me. It made me feel a little spiritual, I guess you could say, like I might start to believe in things, hearing my name echo in that cavernous Berlin apartment, like some angel's clarion trumpeting. Jesus Christ himself could have walked into that room to watch us fucking. He could have joined us even, and I wouldn't have been in the least bit surprised. I would have gone right ahead and taken him into my arms and tried to fuck him too. For she could have been my mother, the way she'd accidentally said my name. She hadn't only said it correctly, she had said it with a tone, one that I hadn't heard in quite some time. It was the tone Ma often used when I'd misbehaved as a child, full of impatience and forbearance and a kind of unimpeachable maternal authority. And hearing it said in that manner filled me with so much joy and so much sorrow all at once that I hardly knew what to do. I only knew that I would do anything to hear it again. There is a very expensive psychoanalyst in New York I saw once who likes this story very much, by the way. The truth, of course, was that she didn't know my name, for I didn't know hers either. I certainly can't recall it now. We'd only met just a few hours beforehand, and so she simply ignored my request and resumed her exertions. I listened closely while we fucked to see if she would stumble upon it again. I began to make various incremental, idiotic adjustments as we continued, in the hopes that I might be able to get her to produce the sound once more. Grips, angles, positions, pressure points. I couldn't make her come, and yet like a fool, I thought that through some elusive yogic arrangement, I could somehow make her say my name. I tried things with my mouth, my dick, my hands. I tried things with her waist, her shoulders, her breasts, her ass, her pussy, her hair. I tried playing with her nipples. I tried playing with my own. When all those failed, I attempted tempo changes, modulations in velocity, adjustments in my attitude, everything else I could think of. Faster, slower, harder, softer, slacker casual, demon lover intense. Eventually, I tried sticking my finger up her asshole, and when that didn't work, and through some crazed logic which escapes me now, though it made perfect sense at the time, tried guiding her fingers up mine. What made me think that her fingers up my ass would make her say my name? After a while, it didn't feel like I was having sex, so much as experimenting in the dark with some impossibly complicated musical instrument, the proper operation of which I could hardly begin to fathom, a description which, if the foregoing hasn't already done the job, probably tells you all that you need to know about what an awful lover I must have been. I didn't know how to hold this instrument, let alone how to play it. I wasn't even sure, in fact, if I was playing the instrument or if I was actually a part of the instrument itself. And after a while, the woman ceased making any noises whatsoever, no doubt exhausted and mystified by my crazy and erratic behavior, my sexual non sequiturs, and we found ourselves humping away silently, robotically, in the most joyless, missionary, clergy-sanctioned manner possible. No sound in the room but our belabored breathing, the rancid stench of sweat filling our nostrils. Neither of us any closer to our specific satisfaction, but we still persisted somehow in going through the literal motions, in and out, up and down, side to side, no closer to heaven, never going to get there. When nobody can say your name, all sex is anonymous sex, in a way. Eventually, she had to finish the job herself. While I lay there with my sweaty bewilderment, having given up on the entire project, she proceeded to masturbate with a silent, marvelous, almost brutal efficiency, succeeding quickly and beautifully where I had so slowly and pathetically failed. It would have been erotic, terrifically sexy, hot, etc., if I hadn't been so preoccupied and if the whole thing hadn't seemed so prosecutorial and accusatory and maybe even pedagogical. And when she finally came, with an elongated and decisive shudder, I finally realized that the noise that she made earlier when she had said my name was not one of pleasure at all, but rather one of exasperation at its continual deferment instead. I had mistaken my name for a groan of sexual frustration. Afterwards, we lay around in the dark with our respective disappointments, trying to make small talk, while the night outside her window slowly turned to day. But our talk was just that, small, thin, polite, evasive, non-committal, disinterested. She was eager for me to leave, I could tell, genuinely mystified by my continued presence in her apartment, my inane chatter, my sudden interest in her furniture, her books, the pictures of her cosmopolitan expatriate friends. And who could have blamed her? I would have wanted me to leave too, given the way I conducted myself. My lingering was a direct affront to every unspoken assumption between us. Not only had I been disappointing, I was now also clearly overstaying my welcome, wandering naked around her apartment, taking an interest in her things. She must have thought that I was a creep, in short, some abject and perhaps even dangerous post-coital loiterer. And the pity which made her beautiful earlier, when I asked her to say my name, seemed mixed now with vigilance and even alarm. "Don't take this the wrong way," she eventually said, getting up and dressing herself. "You're probably a nice person," she continued, "but you really need to go." "But wait," I wanted to say as I gathered my things. "But you said it," I wanted to say as I stumbled out of her door, down her apartment steps, and into the cold Berlin dawn. "But for a moment back there, whether you meant to or not, you sounded exactly like my mother." All right, thanks. You guys have any questions? It's fiction. We're just having fun.
we have time for a couple of questions if anybody has questions. I'll start it off. I'm interested to sort of hear you talk a little bit about the difference between sort of working on this novel that you just read in your sort of stories. I mean, one of the things that was really sort of stunning to me is it seems like in your stories, including the one you just read, sort of the narrator is sort of recessed, not effaced, but like it's recessed. And in this novel, he's the narrator monologuing in a way that's really.
He's like uncomfortably not effaced, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
And it seems like so I was just curious what it was like to sort of switch styles like that.
I'm always, writing is like a series of failed projects for me that I continually can't stop picking up. And so I always have like the thing I'm supposed to be working on, and because I'm a lazy person, I always like end up going and working on the other thing, and then when that makes me really sad and keeps me up at night, I go back to the other thing, and then, and back and forth we go, and then I accomplish nothing. But sometimes I accomplish some stuff. And so, the story in the 90s was actually written while I was taking a break from this slightly more manic voice and more confessional voice, right? And I thought, I just thought it would be really fun and refreshing for myself just to do something that was almost not like this other thing that had been keeping me up nights. And so I thought a lot, and I'd been thinking for a long time about how that beautiful Leonard Michael story in the 50s worked, in which it seems an inventory story of all of the things that happened to the speaker in the 50s. And so I just feel like for me, maybe this is helpful for you, the students in the room too. It's just really helpful to take a break sometimes when you're stuck and just find some other muscle that you haven't been working with, And I often tell my undergraduates when I teach that like the point of being here is not like to find your voice singular, but like you can just find all kinds of voices, you can find all kinds of narrative strategies. You are not possessed of one special God-given voice, although some people may be and may feel that way. I truly believe that, it can be useful just to try, a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and maybe then you're the master of none, but who cares? It's a short life. It's fun. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm interested to know if you, as you're writing or conceiving maybe of a particular project, if there's a spatial component to I guess either in terms of the quality of space that you're conjuring, or maybe how form seems to help you get at space in some way?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, there's a way in which I'm always sort of slavishly devoted to how much or how little a character can see around him or her, or is able to notice. There are certain, I think maybe, in both of the things I read tonight, there are certain things that both of those narrators aren't able to see in the things that they are sort of apprehending around them. Some of it might be something about themselves, some of it might be something about a country, in terms of a larger geographical space that that particular narrator in the 90s seems to be inhabiting. I find that, and so I always begin for some reason, because maybe I'm just curious about who these imaginary people I like are. It sounds so insane, but I'm always interested in what they can and cannot see, and what I can and cannot see through their voices. And so that shapes the kind of space that they tend to create. I think in the 90s was one of the things I was really interested in is what do these what would a person who would make these broad, gigantic generalizations about a country, a decade, a time, a moment in his life, a moment in his family, what would he sound like? How can he sound in a way that it's not insane? I also have an enormous amount of nostalgia for the 90s. I talk about the 90s all the time for some stupid reason, mainly maybe because I was slightly younger and life hadn't really happened to me yet then. And so, I don't know, I know this doesn't answer your question, but I just think I always think about the character and what they can and cannot see, and that usually shapes the space that they tend to move through. As for the form of the work itself, for me, that's a tougher question. I don't know if I can answer that other than to say that I always feel like one of the things I try to do when I write, is try to find some kind of harmonious relationship between the form that the work takes and the subject matter that it's sort of talking about, or the kind of interesting tensions inside of the work has to somehow be delivered formally in a way that intuitively makes sense to the reader, without the reader having to sit in an English class and think about it, that somehow the form gets delivered and it feels like this is the only form it could have been written in this particular story. And without going into specific examples, because I don't think I've been entirely successful, but for example, this week I taught the great Evan Cannell novel, Mrs. Bridge, in which the form of that work has just this incredibly beautiful and organic relationship to the subject matter of Cannell's book, which is the consciousness of, I suppose country club matron would be how her own community would describe it, in Kansas City in the 30s and 40s, and there's a way that beautiful work's form just mirrors its subject and its interests. And so I guess that's how I think about those two questions of form and space. But thinking and doing are totally different things, right? Yeah, you can think about it, yeah, but then you're sitting down, you're like, I don't know where to go from this sentence, so let's worry about that in revision, or, yeah.
I was interested in both stories that the mother kind of makes a pivot or not the novel, part of the novel you read, in the story, there's this sort of broad political, social, cultural landscape that is a preoccupation. I love in both pieces, the sort of implicit political consciousness in them, the first, the economic stuff, the decadence, and what's happening at the end, and the second one, the kind of people can't say your name, what does that say about our sense of otherness, or lack of understanding or empathy for whatever, but I guess otherness, I hate that word, but there's got to be a better one. But then that is also in some kind of precarious interplay with the very personal and subjective, the mother's illness and death, and then this one ends, I don't know where it goes, with the mother's stuff. And I was really interested in those, it just seems like a huge landscape, and really intense, almost lyrical.
Yeah.
And
my therapist is interested in it.
Okay.
But seriously, I think that's a product of me being a child of a single parent in my life. A lot of readers have asked me whether all the fathers have gone, and I was like, I don't know, you tell me. I'm a child of a single mother. And yeah, I don't...
it creates a kind of really interesting tension, too.
Yeah.
There's this intense emotional kind of attachment thing happening while there's also this other issues playing out. So.
Yeah, I think, in the 90s is at its core for me. And, writers always sound so dumb when they talk about their own work sometimes, and I'm one of them, definitely. But at its core, it seems a sort of coming-of-age tale in which the death of the mother is a sort of, what signals the end of the 90s in that story doesn't seem to me to be so much their dawning political consciousness, although there is that at the end of that story, a turning away from the kinds of decadence that you so beautifully sort of characterize the early parts of the story as. But it's the death of the mother. That's what looms large for me in the life of those brothers. Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's life-changing stuff, you know? Yeah, that's a life changer. I don't know, for whatever reason, right? For obvious reasons. Yeah. But I think it's interesting, I mean, to talk about those boys is, I mean, I think one of the things I'm always interested in is how much, like that voice in the 90s is like, it claims to be universal, but it's deeply embedded and personal and actually verges on the narcissistic, right? And that there is suddenly, one of the things I wanted to think about is like, how does that end for somebody? In what ways can that end for somebody? That can come about as a result of political events, a kind of political awakening, surely, you know, in which the fate of others becomes really important, but it can also come with actually being touched by grief and pain, right? Sometimes people, that never ends for some people too, but for that particular character, I think that's one of the ways that ends, you know. You know, I've always loved Rust Hill's definition of the short story. Really simple definition of the short story is something that happened to someone. And I feel like, yeah, the something in that story is the death of the mother. And it's the 90s too, but it's also, for those boys, the death of the mother. But I just feel like that's such a good definition, something that happened to someone. It's like, live by that if you're writing a short story. It just kind of cuts away the fat, you know?
You remember one thing. All right, well, thank you so much for coming. This is really
Thank you.